my co-editor, Sanjay Chakravorty, and I. The book has come out a few months ago, but we never got a chance to present it to the population about which we're writing. So we're very happy to do kind of a half-day conference here, 2 panels. I will actually be speaking on the second panel, so I'm going to hand it over to the President and CEO of Central Sports Research, Yamini Aiyar.
Thank you. Thanks, Neelanjan, and a very warm welcome to everyone in the room and on Zoom to today's discussion. Since the book was out a few months ago, but this is the first formal discussion of the book in Delhi. I think it's in order that we have that, standard moment. So Neelam, Sanjay, both of you, I think we should have the photo op moment to celebrate the launch of the book. And all this. Oh, we didn't take a photo. I'm right back. You are sad. I should exit. So the 2 editors should be photographed. Social media, you need to
the only thing that will remain.
First, take one of this. Okay.
Thank you.
Since nothing is really real unless it makes its way on Twitter, now we have a photograph to put on Twitter, and that will be proof that the book was actually written and produced and discussed. But it's been a real privilege as for CPR and as someone who's been here for perhaps a little longer than one should, be to see the evolution of this book from an idea, a survey, into the actual published book, and also particularly exciting to have once in a while to know that the field site of a study is actually your own home, which has its advantages and disadvantages. Particularly for the editors and authors, the biggest disadvantage is that everybody in CPR, or a large number of people in CPR, live in the city and therefore are even more opinionated than they are on most things when it comes to how they are interpreting this book and what they make of it. So today promises to be a really exciting conversation. Our first panel, all our panelists are here, is really to sort of set the context of the book and try and understand both how should we be studying large metropolitan cities like Delhi. This is an interdisciplinary book. What different disciplines bring, what are the advantages and possible trade-offs of looking at the city through an interdisciplinary lens, and also to discuss the different dimensions of what it takes to really understand the anatomy of a city like ours. So perhaps to kick us off, I'll invite Sanjoy, and not Sanjay, we go there next, to start off by talking to us and just setting the context, and particularly just how it would be very interesting for us to hear how you conceptualized the different ways in which the city needed to be looked at, understood, and studied that forms the chapters in the book.
Thank you, Yamini. Thank you, Neelanjan, CPR. Thank you, everyone here. It's a real pleasure, as Yamini pointed out, to talk to people about themselves and to reflect them. Never to agree, of course. This book has a pretty long gestation period. From conceptualization in around 2013 or so of how to study Indian cities. And we had initially thought of looking at a number of different cities, which we ended up not doing, partly because of funding. And then we focused on a single city, and we tried to do a few things differently. It's to look at the city not in terms of its arbitrary boundary, but as a metropolitan region, which itself is somewhat unusual in India, I think. And we also decided to be robust. We decided to be data-driven as far as possible, to go in with more or less an open mind on what you find. There were a few issues we thought we would focus on. Inequality, of course, is one that comes pretty high up on the list. But the other material sort of emerged really through a process of discovery, really finding out stuff about ourselves. And it felt to me to try to make sense of the tens of thousands of person hours of data collection and analysis and writing that took place. And in my other life, I try to preach the parable of simplicity and direct communication. And I've tried to do that in the introduction chapter, which is called What is Delhi? And the questions that we sort of started with is, can we make claims about Delhi that are generalizable? And they are generalizable, at what scale? To all cities, Asian cities, Indian cities, large cities, capital cities, urban India? Where do you plug Delhi in, or what is Delhi like? You say Delhi is like, what's the word that should go there? Is there an international group of cities within which we can place Delhi? Are there similarities that we can see across countries, perhaps in Asia? Or is Delhi really an Indian city, a very, very large Indian city? Or is it just unique? It's one of a kind. In some ways, it is one of a kind. Lutyens Delhi, roughly where we are, is one of a kind. It really doesn't have a parallel, as far as I know, anywhere in the world. This large, virtually empty space at the center of a major metropolitan area. And how to fit Delhi into the discourse on urban theory? I mean, if we speak to outsiders, not to Delhiites, not to people who know Delhi, they want to understand Delhi in terms of what they know, and what they know is other cities. What they know is urban theory. Can we fit Delhi into the discourse on urban theory? And therein we sort of threw up our hands a little bit, and at least I came to the conclusion that it's not particularly intellectually useful for us to try to fit Delhi into a kind of a international urban theory framework. Because I'm not sure that even if we concluded Delhi is like Beijing, and some people can say Delhi is like Beijing, what difference does it make to Delhi or to Beijing if one is like the other or not? So we sort of said, you know what, we're not going to do that. We're just going to look at Delhi from the inside. And we can try to move towards a theory of Delhi, something that explains Delhi's urban condition, the lives of its citizens. We can try to understand Delhi in terms of a theory of Indian cities, perhaps, or perhaps even try to understand Delhi in terms of theory of India, understand Delhi as symbolic and symptomatic of Indian society at large. And the effort really, such as it is, the 14 chapters are disparate. They pick up different subjects, they have different methods, the specializations the authors bring are different. And you shall see that through the rest of the day. At this level where I operated, where I wrote my stuff, it was trying to make sense of it. And having tried hard, and perhaps not very successfully, we ended up with kind of three crucial issues that I'm going to talk about today. And those three issues are social change, community and state, and inequality, which was really our starting point. So social change, and this is a given in urban theory, which is urbanization is expected to lead to social change, right? There are changes in biological reproduction, family sizes get smaller. There are changes in social reproduction, values change, ideologies change, education changes, minds and thinking frameworks. Traditional community is supposed to decline. Individual identity is supposed to increase. And all of this comes from, once again, urban theory developed in a Euro-American framework, beginning perhaps with Germans, but certainly taken up very much by Americans and so on. We try to frame it in terms of the Ambedkar-Gandhi debate. This is a famous quote. Gandhi said, "The soul of India lives in its villages." And Dr. Ambedkar said, what is a village but a sink of localism, a den of ignorance, narrow-mindedness, and communalism. So what is Delhi then? What is its soul like? Does urbanization actually lead to social change in India? This is not a question that is any longer framed as a question in Western epistemology. It's just taken for granted that it is. And the evidence we picked up was dispiriting, to say the least. There's one big positive, which is gains in education, particularly women's education. We also found that more educated women tend not to enter the labor market, that the education seems to be a signaling device for the marriage market. We found almost complete endogamy. There's almost no evidence of marriage outside the community or support for it. More than 19 of 20 respondents were disapproving of interreligious, intercaste, interlanguage, and interclass marriages. There's an extraordinary level of commensal segregation. People don't eat together. 2/3 of Muslims and 3/4 of Hindus have never had a meal in a non-relative's home. Less than 40% of Hindus would ever think of sharing a meal with Muslims. Now, when we first started finding this, and we started talking to a few people about this, they told us our data must be wrong. Because we trust our methodology, led by Neelanjan, of course, we sort of knew our data was right. And I think subsequent events have proven that our data was right, and our earlier thought bubbles, what we thought we knew based on the little information bubbles that we inhabit, were actually very limited information bubbles. So what are the implications of this finding? One possibility is that the recent political discourses have hardened attitudes between social groups. Not only that people feel quite confident in being openly discriminatory. It has become common sense to say you don't like somebody, or you don't like a particular group, you don't associate with other people. The other possibility is that following the ideas of people like Ashish Nandi, who've talked about this, and Partha Chatterjee, this dualistic inner outer pure polluted domain division, it's inside our heads. This is a pretty resilient ideological structure, and mere urbanization doesn't shake it that much. That faced with the heterodoxy of urban life, the fact that you have to encounter people not like you, you have to kind of be in a subjugated position in our very hierarchical system pretty much most of your life. That families and individuals dig deep into what we can consider their inner cultural resources. And it is possible that they become anti-modern and anti-urban at home in their everyday behavior. It's sort of an assertion really of identity. This is speculation. Really, we don't have any proof of this. And it would take some imaginative investigation to try to prove it. We didn't have those resources. We weren't expecting to find this. Let's be honest. So one of the things I concluded was Delhi may be much more like village India than we realize. That it's the gadi raste and the glitz, the glamour, the malls, and all of that. They are probably just surface manifestations of something that's somewhat hidden, somewhat deeper, which is how people think, what's going on inside their heads. One of the conclusions I came to is that it may be necessary to question the stylized fact of social change brought about by urbanization, at least for India. I mean, I'm not getting into international comparisons at all, at least in this topic. Are we doing on time? Okay. The other issue was about the relationship between community and state. One of the things we expect with the modernization theory is that there should be a declining significance of religious and caste identities and a rising significance of new groupings, new identities that are based on class, location, housing, consumption, politics, education, etc. New clubs should be formed, right? There are political clubs, there are social clubs, there are clubs that in which people have a common cause, have a specific agenda, or they're like each other. We can think of this in terms of bridging and bonding forms of social capital. So the bonding forms of social capital is what I just talked about, the deep-suited, the cultural resource of identity, which does not seem to be in decline. But at the same time, there is plenty of evidence of the rise of bridging forms of social capital, that new groups are indeed forming. Some born of expediency, some born of immediate need, of political purpose, or just taste or preference. Now, most groups actually form to interact with the state. Because the state, as we know, is multifarious in Delhi. There's multiple levels of state delivering different kinds of services with different levels of complexity. And it as an individual, not belonging to any group at all, it is very, very difficult, unless you are quite wealthy, in which case your money trumps everything. It is very difficult to actually negotiate with the state just by yourself. So you form these collectives. RWA, for instance, is a very famous Delhi example of dealing with the state. And these numerous forms of groups that deal with the state have come up. They operate on a regular basis. To deal with housing, possession, dispossession. Srivastava has worked quite a bit on dispossession issues, infrastructure, crime, pollution, education, etc. People has worked significantly on pollution, and he's going to talk about that. In addition, because Delhi is the Rajdhani, there's a lot of national level from discourse to antagonism to straight up street fights that happen in Delhi that don't happen in other cities, actually, from India Against Corruption, the Nirbhaya movement, Shine Bagh, farmers' protests. You all know these stories. The point I'm sort of making is that this interaction of social and state actions is somewhat a relatively understudied portion of urban theory. And if people want to get serious about urban theory, and they ought to take this angle somewhat more seriously, because there are significant kind of issues and findings that one can discover that are somewhat more complicated than the simpler polarization discourse that we often kind of limit ourselves to. And the third issue, rushing right along, is inequality, which I've been working personally in my other lives on inequality pretty much from graduate school onwards in its different forms. I believe inequality is a defining feature of Indian society. I believe that we actually have no idea how much inequality there is. Income inequality in India is very high. Wealth inequality is extremely high. However, we have no idea how big it is because our social accounting system has so far simply failed to account for it. We don't have a method. Honestly, we don't have a method. Inequality is also a central issue in urban studies everywhere. From the very beginning of the formation of serious cities from the mid-19th century, from Marx, who basically came up with his theorization fundamentally based on what he saw was happening in the newly industrializing cities of England, to people like William Julius Wilson, David Harvey. Any number of people have theorized about this. And multiple chapters in the book look at inequality, at what it is and what it does. Neelanjan was instrumental in creating a new asset inequality index, which we believe is a very powerful tool. And a number of our authors use Neelanjan's index, use their own data to kind of tell really detailed stories about inequality. You're going to hear some of those in the second half today. What inequality is a difference in material possessions, right? I mean, it's very, very simple between social groups and housing types. Marginalized social groups, and we know who they are, what we call our scheduled castes and tribes, have significantly fewer assets than Sikhs and upper caste families, and live in lower quality and more crowded housing. And this is obvious stuff, right? There's nothing surprising about this. There are clusters of social groups with low assets, Muslims who are quite strongly clustered, and Dalits who are also reasonably strongly clustered, but less so. Asset inequality, asset ownership declines from the core city outward. It's a reversal of the US model. Recent migrants suffer a spatial disadvantage. Khusdeep Malhotra is going to talk about it in the second half. What inequality does is it changes access to infrastructure services and access to problem solvers. It creates a system of differentiated citizenship by housing category. Shahana is going to talk about it, I believe, in the second half. Housing problems are fundamentally different between the classes. From worries about service quality, a 5-minute power cut is intolerable. A 1 day of water supply delivery disruption is intolerable at the upper end. To negotiating displacement is being thrown out from your home being demolished at the other end. Households with more assets are able to solve their problems quite effectively. The asset-rich handle day-to-day issues of water supply and sanitation through private means. They don't have to rely on the state or public services. And there are multiple social inequalities between religions and social groups. We unfortunately can't carry out comparative studies. We can't even compare between Indian cities. There are very serious data deficiencies. There are very serious weaknesses in our social accounting system, which, if you have time, we can talk about. And going forward, it's something people in this room should take very, very seriously, because we really don't know enough about ourselves to take good steps of how to actually move forward. We can't even be sure whether spatial inequality is increasing or decreasing, once again, because we can't compare places or times. We can't do international comparisons. We can't compare, Delhi inequality to Beijing inequality. We can't do any of that. All we can tell you is what it is in Delhi. What we would like to point out, this is close to the end, is that The epistemology of urban inequality as it stands now does not give much attention to the dangers posed by majoritarian politics in polarized societies and cities. And this is something new in India. Not brand new, but it is there in a more pervasive sense than it has existed for a very long time. And I submit that it may be necessary to go beyond the usual inequality frameworks of paisa, housing, etc., and begin to think of inequality in terms of, say, the new political geography of hate, and how ghettoization and spatial marginalization can be looked at anew with fresh eyes, fresh perspectives. If there's a meta narrative of Delhi, Delhi is like this. The question we started that, and we ended up with saying, if there is a meta narrative, it's one of contradiction. Delhi is a city of contradictions. Delhi citizens are modern urban beings, and they are traditional village residents at the same time. They, I think, represent, I'm not speaking of people in this room, by the way.
Oh, you'd be surprised.
Please don't say that. So the push and pull of tradition and modernity in India and Delhi, we have this deep rural well of abundant labor, abundant cheap labor. This is the old Lewisian framework. The increasing mistrust and friction between social groups by religion and caste. Actually hesitant and slow urbanization, gaping social and economic inequalities, climbing aspirations. What we have is a society that really is simultaneously being pulled by the past, and the past seems to be going back further in time. Not 50 years, not 100 years, not 150 years. We seem to be hearkening back in some senses to an even further past. At the same time that we are being pulled by technology, devices, and modernity. And it is this contradictory space that we currently inhabit, the city inhabits and the society inhabits. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sanjoy. I will ask Sanjay to offer his remarks.
So when Sanjoy said to me that in the morning sessions that people without data, it was like, I guess, like saying people without hope or meaning in life. As an anthropologist, I guess it's okay. But so, what I'll do is I'll just spend a couple of minutes on the chapter that was there in the book, and then move on to extending that discussion to think about what I'm doing in terms of building upon the argument of the chapter. So the chapter we know was about ideas of community, capital, and the state. Community in inverted commas, and how people think of ideas community. So it was an ethnography of the state, if you like, ethnography of private capital, and ethnography of so-called community. So one part of the chapter was how people in what used to be a basti of Nangla Machi, I don't know, you must have heard of it, near Pragati Maidan, which was demolished. There, of course, people distrusted the state, but their distrust was translated in terms of making communities, so trusting those in that community who could do illegal work in a proper manner with tariqa and deal with the state. So it didn't get them into trouble. So the whole chain is involved, right? So there was not to become the state, but deal with the state in specific kinds of ways and trust those who can do the illegal work, making fake ID documents, etc. Those are the most trustworthy people. So never want to become the community, never want to become the state, but deal with the state through those who can constitute community through illegality. The second part of the article was about looking at DLF. They're also middle class residents, well-off middle class residents, very different from the Nangla Machi profile, distrust the state, but there the ideas community emerged differently, as you can imagine. And one of the ideas that I was thinking about is the manner in which private capital creates its own community. So DLF is the most significant umbrella body of RWAs in DLF is something that's sponsored by, in DLF city, Gurgaon, New Gurgaon, is something that's sponsored by DLF itself. It used to at least have its offices inside the DLF building, one of the DLF buildings. So I was thinking about what happens then about the traditional categories that political scientists have between civil society and government, etc. How does this collapse? And how then do we think about this division that have come to us through various social science mechanisms when private capital creates its own community, its own civil society, as it were. So that was the discussion of the paper. What I want to do now, very quickly, is to think about how these, what I want to do, sorry, is I will preface with saying that what I want to, just to following out from Sanjoy's presentation, that my overall framework is to think about in a city where you have neoliberal processes, but I would suggest not neoliberal subjects, that you can have both. I think and what we tend to often think that one produces the other. That I'm suggesting to you that ethnographically that's not true, right? So, and that's what this presentation is about, thinking about relations between private capital, so-called ideas of community, and the state. And this is based on, as you know, okay. So as you know, the last couple of decades, etc., there's been a lot of, there is data in here, by the way. It's a data-driven kind of stuff. That's only data I have. Sorry. So, not so bad. Not so bad. So it's about big data. So as you know, the last 2 decades, a little bit longer, there's been this kind of data-driven push into cities and planning and mapping. And this is based on that. On some fieldwork that I've been doing.
Yeah, Neelan will have to fix it. I think that it's not moving on the screen so often. Yeah, see, now it will move. It's a weird thing. I don't know why that happened.
Oh, that's right. So let me just unshare and reshare. Sorry about that.
The most crucial part of any presentation. You were saying I should have had videos. I mean, PowerPoint is limited. So, as you know, the data-driven push in many societies, not just India, and many post-colonial societies, is about how data itself, technology itself, will overcome deep-rooted structural problems, right? And you know, that's a very common theme. Whether it's private education, there's so-called Indian education reform movement, which people go and from NGOs and teach in government schools. Isn't the notion that certain things can leapfrog structural problems? So this is the data-driven urban planning is partly linked to that. I'm not saying this is a technology terrible thing. I'm only suggesting that some aspects of it can be looked at in different ways. So this is really an ethnography of one little lane in Sonia Vihar, which is northeast Delhi, where, as you know, worked on this, that there was, it's not happening now, but if in an unauthorized colony, if you wanted it authorized, the government will issue a notice saying, now this is the cutoff date, this is what you need to do. And the process was that the local RWA or the unauthorized, everyone has an RWA, would submit a locally drafted plan of that locality, which would then be sent to the UD, Urban Development Department. And then it will send it to a body in Delhi, which used to do the mapping. Of course, the maps came from American satellites in terms of the nuance that they were able to produce. So this particular lane is under dispute. It still is. It's been under dispute since 2004. The residents there say it actually falls in Delhi, whereas the Delhi government satellite maps and actually falls in UP. And that's an interesting kind of thing anyway. But ethnographically, it's interesting for me for a number of reasons. I won't go into them. So the mapping is part of providing official status. And so it really is an ethnography of this 230-meter lane to think about the relationship between so-called citizens, private capital, and the state, which is the theme that I explored in the article as well. So this is the kind of map people submit. Actually, a hand-drafted huge map, which is stretched from from there to here. In 2004, 2008, the Resident Association of Sonia Vihar, one of them, there were several, of course, sent the map to Delhi government. We sent it to the organization, and here I'm calling DSI for verification. And DSI in turn produced a satellite map. In the residence map, as I said, lane number 2 is shown as part of Delhi, right? Where the the DSI map is shown as part of Uttar Pradesh. And of course, UP is just on the border, in fact. So there's a dispute about, there's a file that thick with the UD, there are politicians involved, and of course, there are mapping companies involved, ARC, GIS, for example, all kinds of mapping. So I'm interested in what this tells us about a city in terms of relationship between the people as a category, the state, and the capital and private capital. So one thing the residents say, and someone said lane was really here, right? Someone has stolen a lane, right? It should be in Delhi. And the Delhi government then refuses to tar the lane, providing infrastructure. You can't have any documents which say that your house is here, because who is it in Uttar Pradesh? Is it in Delhi? And whenever I presented this to kind of a data-minded audience, they actually say, what is the problem? The maps are transparent. Of course, the thing is, the maps are never transparent. So I'm interested in the politics of what actually happens on the ground, caste and land mafias, etc. So the RWA has made several representations to the Delhi government. The satellite map is incorrect, and the corruption has led to the theft of the lane. And someone went to the DSI and said, no, this should be shown in UP, not in Delhi, and that's the form of corruption. Okay. So the first theme I just want to quickly go through is the notion of a city anti-politics and ordinary citizens. What I'm going to suggest to you here is over the last 2 decades, a new notion of an ordinary person has arisen. So under the kind of older Nehruvian model, we had an ordinary person as the poor person, the farmer, Dalit, the Muslim. And I think and the new idea of the ordinary person is a middle-class person, who now increasingly argues that we're the one who've been discriminated against. All these people have stolen electricity, there's been minority appeasement, what have you, and that there's a new ordinary person that's emerged. So part of the context, I think, of this mapping regime that's emerged is the context of technology, the city, and the new ordinary citizen, whose views have been putatively, historically ignored, right? And must now be listened to, the particular middle class, a very specific middle class kind of person, the kind of person that I was discussing in the article in the book. Linked to this is, of course, the politics is corrupt and corrupting, right? And that what you need is more technology in all these spaces to be able to really see through what is actually there. And of course, for that reason, a very large number of urban government processes have been technologized. I'm not suggesting we should go back to the days when I had to go to New Delhi's railway station line up for a ticket and not use the IRCTC website. I'm actually talking about the broader issues within which we see technology in urban planning. So that's the first context, the city, anti-politics, and ordinary citizen, new kind of ordinary citizen. So new ordinary citizen is a middle-class citizen, of a particular kind, particular religion, for example. So the emergence, and the Aam Aadmi Party in its early days was very much a manifestation of capturing the notion of who is a new ordinary person. What is a new form of ordinariness? It is not the Nehruvian ordinariness, if I to put it crudely, but a new person. Okay, so that's the first context I'm thinking about. The second thing I want to think about is the notion of how cities have become a relationship between this capital and the state, but to reform the state. And I think that's something you see in Delhi quite a lot. How should the state be reformed? And that is also linked to, I think, a change in the state-society distinction, where at an earlier point in time, there was a very strict demarcation. This is the state, but this is society. Whereas increasingly you have all kinds of, say, advisors, consultants, global companies that have now offices inside buildings. So that divide has been breached. I think that's changed. And Delhi is a very good example of it because it's the capital city. New relationship between state and private capital, civil society groups, international organizations since the early 2000s also characterize cities such as Delhi, which tell us something about data-driven technology in cities. And there are also new templates that for comparing cities. So it's now almost compulsory in global discourse to see both states and cities as comparable, irrespective of the historical trajectories. So you have, for example, various companies. I'm thinking of reports such as this one was called the Innovation Benchmark, published by PwC, the Industry Compliance Benchmark Report, Deloitte, and the Industry Reference Model. So there's emerged the spectrum of comparisons that states must be comparable, cities must be comparable, which is part of a new nationalism as well, that we can be compared to anyone else in the world. We are like this particular, and so that has seeped its way into the way the state sees itself, that it should reform itself, what it wants to be. The third is actually what happened on the ground, Sonia Vihar. Here it's a cast of satellites. So what happens, Sonia Vihar, for example, you have, obviously, like many others have worked on this, is that the largest landlord owners are, of course, the villagers, the Gujar landlords, right? And it's often said in Sonia Vihar that what happened is that Gujar landlords have bribed the DSI because they want to maintain their dominance of the dominant caste. Why? Because they said if infrastructure improves, as Lane becomes part of Delhi, the selling and buying that is happening constantly because infrastructure is poor, people come and find this is a terrible place to live and then move on. He said that will stop. And who are the real estate agents and who are considered land mafia? The dominant caste there. So the interesting way in which people imagine, or I think on the ground, you can talk about the caste of satellites, for example. Okay. Well, so that's one. So what's the relationship between macro processes and what happens in one particular lane? And multiple maps submitted by different resident associations. And of course, these are different resident associations placed like Sonia Vihar are linguistically, religious, and ethnically diverse and based on these kind of identities. So how do we understand satellites and big data in terms of the kind of things that socials are interested in? As Sanjoy mentioned, caste, ethnicity, that kind of stuff. There's also the idea of technology's opacity. Of course, technology allows you to do certain things, but it also allows you to not do certain kinds of things because electoral politics on the ground, if there's election, MLA will say, look, I'll get this done for you. And technology, ironically, on the ground is a common way in which people will say, well, we don't know why this happens, technological problem, right? So it also allows for a certain kind of opacity in a city such as Delhi. And of course, there's the capacity to aspire. I said to you that I began this presentation by saying that I'm interested in neoliberal processes that don't neoliberal subjects. Everyone aspires, right? So here, the poor are very much wanting to be part of neoliberal processes. It's not that they are kind of our last bulwark against global capitalism. There's no reason why there should be. And then simultaneously, they're also part of local networks that will sometimes oppose what we see in the processes. Okay, so that's the kind of final context I wanted to talk to you about thinking about states, civil society, and so citizens, the state. The citizens have aspirations. Simultaneously, they also want an old-fashioned welfare state, and also a newer state that can do things technologically. And the middle class is the new ordinariness. Secondly, the state, the changing nature of the state, new relationship with different class fractions of private capital. The city is the site of reforming the state and technology of opacity and governance. And finally, there is private capital, which produces increasingly, I think, quite interesting ways, the complete compulsion to compare through these different kinds of reports. And the production then of a GIS specialist, as you said, that what we really need are platform cities. So move from application cities, where you go to a specific department, to platform cities. So these are some of the things I thought I'd bring up in terms of my own ethnography for that particular lane in Sonia Vihar, which speak to exactly kind of things I know that particular book explores, and certainly my chapter explores.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanjay. Keep going.
Thank you. I'm tired of streets. I have to speak. Let me just, first of all, thank you to Sanjoy and to Neelanjan for this beautiful book. I came to the book a bit late after the survey and things are done, but I really enjoyed rereading the book after you said, why don't you come over for this, get together. Unlike Sanjay, what I'm going to do is come to my own piece a bit towards the end. For a reason that one of the difficulties that I'm facing is at the moment when I wrote what I wrote for this book, which is pollution, and I do some work on urban environment, is a very different moment from the moment today. This difference is at several levels. One, all of us know as you move from Lathians Delhi to Central Vista Delhi, that itself is going to make a lot of difference. But more specifically for the kind of research that I do, COVID, of course, has been an event that's completely forced me to try and think and rethink how we think about environment, what matters, what should matter. And Partho called me up for something about a week back. He said, "Kya kar rahe ho aajkal?" I said, "I'm trying to put germs and particles together." And he said, "Do you want a unified theory of air?" So I said, well, that is not quite possible, but I do think something more complex has to be offered if you want to take both
what we are more familiar with, which is in terms of pollution through particulate matter and the politics around it that has gone on for about 2 decades. And you want to think about germs, which we had kindly parked past, saying that the epidemics are over. These are not our concerns today. And I think it poses certain questions. I'm not going to be able to do what exactly it's doing in terms of thinking about public health, environment, etc. But clearly, there's this moment of reflecting on that essay is a different moment from when that essay was written. A couple of things that I'll just do in terms of following on Sanjoy's three themes that he outlined: inequality, state, community, and on social change. The first thing I want to talk about was scale. I think one of the things that COVID's forced us to do is not just NCT and CR, but to take very seriously the idea of proximate distance, which is that Wuhan and Delhi can be proximate, and think of those flows and scales in terms of what happens locally. This was always part of anybody who tried to do a city level thing, to what happens to the different flows. But I think it has come back in a very strong way to think about these different notions of proximity and things flowing from one place to another. The other thing that I think has happened is that we are at a moment where it is not necessarily as would have been, say, the case 30 years back, where it's urban and rural, city and countryside. My own sense is that increasingly cities are contesting with their own pasts. Mumbai is trying to contest with an imagined cosmopolitan Mumbai, Bombay. If you look at Supreme Court judgments on pollution in Delhi, my sense is that there is a lot of assumption and history and background context that goes into when a judge writes Delhi was once a beautiful city. So there's a sense that it's not Delhi versus, say, a peri-urban region or the countryside, but it's contemporary Delhi versus its own past. And I think the past comes back in interesting ways. For this city specifically, it came back very powerfully in 1857, after 1857, when you had this poetry about the lament about a particular social order passing away. It came in 1947, post-partition, and the novels that were written in its wake. There's a sense in which, for Delhi, the past keeps coming back in interesting ways. And I think it's a question to ask, what does it mean to speak of that past, not simply as a linear history, but how we return to different pasts in order to be able to claim a certain contemporary moment. The other broad thing around this whole business of what kind of transition happens socially. Now, I think everybody in this book is convinced, every author is convinced, I think most of you are probably also convinced, that certainly for the last 3 decades, something new has happened. There have been major ways in which new kinds of subjects, as Sanjay was saying, have been formed, certainly as far as Delhi is concerned and pollution is concerned. Starting mid-1990s, you get a series of judgments that have completely transformed the city. So clearly something new has happened. My sense is that our description of this newness typically takes a secular language. I think the most elegant thesis that was written in the context of pollution and transformation was Amitabh Bhaviskar's bourgeois environmentalism. But in that bourgeois environmentalism, it is my suspicion that there's little space for caste and religion. So if you look at some of the new stuff that's being written, there's Mukul Sharma writing on Dalits and nature. There's Shivani Kapoor, who's a young scholar based at, I think, Jindal. She's been doing a lot of work on smell. And there's another new book that's come out on Calcutta by Navaparna Ghosh. And Navaparna Ghosh's book is a very detailed inquiry into hygiene practices. And her argument is, as the Bengali middle class starts to make a distinction between the paras and the bastis, hygiene is not a secular discourse or practice. It is highly marked by caste and religion. It is in fact upper caste Hindu hygienic ideas that take the form of what constitutes a hygienic city. In some senses, very important questions regarding caste and religion have come to this discourse on pollution and environment in a way that I think was not the case earlier. I mean, I certainly, if I look at reports that have been put out by CSE, other institutions, you find no mention of these things. I had a book that I did once, which was on Delhi, and when I was looking at slaughterhouses and people who are engaged in those trades, you can see it. It so powerfully marks their practice and their claims. But in our writings, somehow, the talk about environment becomes entirely secular and devoid of these other categories of caste. It tends to become almost class or economic divide, that kind of thing. And I'm very much with you that there is a lot to think with in terms of different aspects of urban life around issues of caste that we still haven't quite dealt with. On inequality, the thing that struck me most, you're right about this ghettoization. I think what strikes you is Delhi is an incredibly attractive city for migrants. And yet, all of us have seen they voted with their feet that this is not home. So despite this being such an attractive city for migrants, and I come from a state that exports many such migrants, it has failed to become a home. And this is something that all of us who live and work in Delhi must think. When does a city become home and for whom? And clearly, it seems that for the migrant workers of Delhi, it has failed to become a home. And that must be a serious lapse, because if you discount the recent riots in Northeast Delhi, for some time now, Delhi has been a fairly open city as far as migrants are concerned. So it's something to think with. Okay, let me just go back to the essay that I wrote. It's a historical account of air pollution. I've done some work on Delhi, and then I did a book on Bombay and Calcutta on the history of air pollution. And one of the things that I was interested in looking at is what changes about it. One of the things that surprised my readers and those who have presented my work to is when I informed them that the first laws were passed in 1862-63, and the second set of laws in 1905, 1912 for Calcutta and Bombay. And so air pollution has been a concern for very long. It took the form of smoke when they were talking about air pollution in earlier times. Now we talk about particulate matter. And in some senses, what has happened is we have moved from a regime of visible pollution to a regime of invisible pollution. And that seems to have been one big transition that has happened for the last 100, 150 years. When you're thinking about urban pollution, that you have to deal with things that are more and more invisible to us. Now, if you place that alongside COVID, then you get another invisible element, which is the virus. And you get an even more invisible element, which is the latent carrier. Now, the latent carrier is a kind of a figure about which several people have written, because it's a fear of the unknown. You don't know who could be infecting you, and the blame games that come along with that. And whether those blame games have something to do with your class, caste, religion, neighborhood, etc., are also issues that have become very important. In our case, it's been more difficult to do that kind of work. Clearly, in the American context, there's a lot that has been written about relationship between race and this blame game that goes on about who's the disease carrier. Historically, we know that in the modern West, all kinds of people have been suspected, including Indians, Japanese, whoever traveled to the West, as potential carriers of disease. And so that's something that invisibility that cities have to deal with is certainly part of what I've tried to look in that essay. This transition from a visible concern with visible smoke to invisible particulate matter. but also to think more with this idea of what is visible, what is invisible, and the kind of fears that they produce. The other thing that I look in that essay is around location and technology. Now, it's a very interesting archival nugget that when Calcutta first proposed to relocate its industry, there was actually an opposition on very sensible grounds, saying that if you're going to take them outside, the workers are going to live near the industry, so they're going to suffer anyway. And the winds will bring back the smoke to the city. So there's no point relying on relocation to get rid of the smoke. My sense is it was a pretty sensible argument, and it keeps coming back whether relocation is a good strategy, what does it do? Till in Delhi's case, as we know, in the series of judgments that Supreme Court passed 1996 onwards, relocation became the major thing. Actual relocation, how much it happened, did not happen is another story. But the idea that you throw out, there's something to be said for planning concerns around hazardous and noxious industries. I'm not saying it's all wrong, but the costs of those relocation, as we all know, can be pretty high for many different kinds of people, certainly for people who work in those industries. In any case, it doesn't get rid of the pollution. So that's a concern that you see both historically and in the contemporary, with very different outcomes, because once planning has taken hold, certain kinds of industry obviously cannot remain in the city. And then, therefore, what can remain then becomes a question. The other one, which is an interesting debate, is around technology. And there are a series of debates that happen there. Primarily, it is about if you can produce more efficiently, then the businessman gains and the city gains. And this was the argument that was very forcefully put forward, both by colonial officials and by Indian businessmen, most importantly, the House of Tatas. Now, I haven't come across any history of the House of Tatas and the relationship to environment. Our business histories are particularly poor. They have very little to tell us about these things. But the Tatas are very interesting because when they set up their first hydroelectric power plant at Lonavala, the argument was this is clean energy. No more coal. Bombay is going to be clean. Of course, there is a big protest movement that happens in Pune district because of the land that is submerged because of this plant. But as far as their own self-claim was concerned, it was about cleaning up Bombay. And so all the captive coal, production of energy that was happening will no longer happen. Hydroelectric power will be supplied, and the Tatas were. And at first I thought it was just business sale happening. I have since found out that when they set up Jamshedpur, they took the guy from Bombay who was a smoke inspector and said, "Come to Jamshedpur because we don't want any smoke in the Jamshedpur." So there does seem to be a certain concern, whether it was entirely aesthetic, whether it was for business purposes, whether it was a genuine concern. We don't know unless we do some more research. The Tatas, of course, are not very, they have an archive, but they're not very helpful with their archive in terms of getting these materials. But there's something to be said around technology. This technology question became very important because it was all about what kind of fuel will be used, how efficiently, how do you train the fireman, those kinds of things. In a very rough correspondence, I'm suggesting that the CNG debate is something like that. It is who should tell you what is a good technology, the state or the industry? And this was a debate that happened in colonial times. This happens today. There's a lot of reliance on change from diesel to CNG as solving issues. My own reading is it did for some time till the number of vehicles became too many. And so overall, we don't know how much the gain has been, but there is this other framework within which, pollution in cities have been debated as to what kind of technological choices are to be made and by whom. These have kind of been very familiar Delhi stories, because these are two very big stories about CNG and about relocating industry. There are two small stories that I'll be done very quickly with. One is around waste. You have this waste to energy plant in Okla that has been subject of much debate and critique, and people who love it, people who hate it. Incinerators as a technology is a very old technology. It's been tried in India before, it was tried in Bombay, it was tried in Calcutta, given up. 1870s, 80s, these came up, given up since then. It makes a comeback first in Timarpur, then this Okla plant. And there are concerns, a number of concerns around this. There's some concern about whether the Indian waste, the quality of the waste is such that it is economical to set up these plants. I'm not very well informed on that. There are concerns around dioxin that comes out. And those who are in favor of the plants say that waste has been converted to electricity, and therefore what you're getting is energy, etc. But there is a whole debate around livelihood, health, and changing waste into something which is beneficial, which has been hugely controversial and is going on till today. The last one that I wanted to figure out is something that came up with Diwali firecrackers. And this is when the Supreme Court tied itself into a tangle, trying to define what is essential religious practice. I don't know if you followed this whole controversy, but in the first set of judgments, they said bursting crackers is not part of Hinduism, lighting is real, etc. By the time this goes to the National Green Tribunal, that language has been given up. Because courts have other religions to define what is essential and what is not. On this one, they gave up. They simply said, let's have a balance. You produce what are called green firecrackers, and then bursting firecrackers. So there's a change in that language. I think it's a very important shift. It's a very subtle shift. But whether it's the business of courts to tell what is essential religious practice comes up and evaporates because the larger concern was around environment. So one of the things I've tried to do, both here in the books that I've tried to write or have written, is to take. I completely agree with Amita's basic proposition, but I'm saying that each instance also throws up new dimensions, which are very interesting to look at, whether it concerns culture, whether it concerns livelihood, or it concerns health, etc. My final point, just to go back, if the COVID produces one kind of new context, for me personally, there's this whole business around extreme weather events, climate change, etc. At one point in my own personal trajectory, I parked these aside as matters that have been, in an older sense, we have a lot of urban literature around sanitation, old climate determinism, a lot of historical geography around that. I thought these questions are done and dusted. Time to move on to other questions. But it's obvious that that extreme weather events, these heat waves that are going on in Europe, and we have just gone through it. Thank God for this beautiful monsoon day. It's forcing us to take into account things that are familiar but are changing in very important ways. And one of the pieces in this book, the author is not here, but someone whose work I've started following more and more now is Radhika's work on cooling, and the demand for cooling and what it is doing to the way we think about environment. What that has suggested to me is perhaps what we haven't done enough with is, while we do a lot of work on housing as a problem, we haven't quite looked at homes as environments or the indoors as environments. And I think if we shift from the outdoor to the indoor, some of these important concerns around energy use, around consumption that Sanjay has written so much about, around cooling and heating requirements, I think these will begin to make far more sense to us to think about things like climate and climate change and local pollution, and how do you kind of talk about them together. It's obviously it's not a job that one person can do. Neither is it going to be easy. So you do need more volumes like this. So Sanjay, invitation to be editor for another book. I think this thing is, in brief, what I'm saying is I thought there were certain questions, two questions that I thought were history. One was epidemics. One was this old style, environmental determinism that has to do with climate, etc. That's stable and fixed. I think both of these have to come unstuck. And as they have come unstuck, those of us who think and write about urban environments will have to think very differently.
Thank you. Thank you. I think through these three presentations, all of us who are curious about the book and interested in the book have got a really, really good flavor of the many different dimensions that this book has to present, and also why it's so important to have interdisciplinary approaches to understand complex and very contradictory cities. In some senses, my presence on this panel is one of being the least qualified to speak to the book, in that I'm not part of the book, I'm not an author of the book, and I think a little bit about urban, but not as much as perhaps one should. But on the other hand, I am have had fortune or misfortune, depending on how you want to look at it, of having spent a really rather large proportion of my life living in the city. And in more ways than one, a lot of what is reflected in the book reflects on the lived experience too of having been part of this city and been through and observed as well as participated in all the many changes and status quoism that the city represents, which has been articulated in this book. I think, and in some ways, I think I represent many of the contradictions that you ended your presentation with, Sanjay. If I think of just myself, my own person and what the city brought for me, it is that very, very thin sliver, and you position it as Gandhi versus Ambedkar, but more the idea of cosmopolitanism in India. My father's family came to Delhi from Tamil Nadu, owing in more ways than one to a social revolution in Tamil Nadu that made it very difficult for an Aiyar Brahmin perhaps to seek opportunity of the kind that they wanted in their city. My maternal grandmother came as a Sardani who came from Amritsar, found a home in Delhi as a very young widow, as a place of opportunity where she could perhaps rebuild her life away from the constraints of what her married joint family wanted to place upon her. And both sides of these families, in fact, my paternal grandmother was also widowed very young. As two young widows in a cosmopolitan environment were able to break free of many of the constraints that they would have experienced in other contexts, and build their lives. And that my parents could come together as a Hindu and a Sikh to have a family in which I grew up, where we visited the temple as often as my Sikh mother was willing to take us, which actually over time became a little too frequent for teenagers. We were going there every week. So in some ways, the experience of living in the cosmopolitan nature of what the city had to offer created an opportunity for a pan-Indian notion of what it and a sense of nationhood. And at the same time, living in that city through the 1984 riots, I mean, it is the majoritarianism of today is not unknown to the city. We lived through the 1984 riots, wondering what would happen if the rioters showed up in a half Hindu, half Sardar home, and where we would go, worrying desperately about my grandmother who lived in an elite colony, in defense colony, who was a Sardarni. So we, parts of Delhi have also experienced violence that broke some of the boundaries of inequality. And yet, it's also a city which further reinforced every kind of inequality that shapes both India today as well as how we think about policy and practice. The biases that we of majoritarian politics, the Hindu-Muslim divide that shapes a lot of Delhi today, a lot of our North Indian politics today, all the seeds of it were very visible in the Banya school that I went to, where I was the unusual one, which was this mix from all over this country, whereas everybody else had a very different imagination, or a large proportion of students had a different imagination. These were elites. Over time, what's also interesting about the city is that its own professional class shifts. And you would assume amongst the elites that in that shift of professional class, there would also be a shift of identity of what the city is and what the city represents. I think that's happened to a degree. And it's not just an elite transition, it's also happened across the flavor of the city. Deepu, you spoke about the migrants and why the migrants haven't yet made Delhi their home. It is because Delhi is probably, in its elitism and its inequities, not necessarily a welcoming home. But at the same time, parts of the great expansion that happened in the city, the big infrastructure development of the late 90s and early 2000s, it didn't happen in the central vista of Delhi. It happened across the outskirts of Delhi in the form of slum rehabilitation of Delhi, and in the form of bringing in of the Purvanchalis into the imagination of the Delhiite. We never closed schools for Chhat Puja when I was in Delhi. Now it's part and parcel of the entire cluster of holidays that we get. So it absorbs parts of what it receives, but it doesn't dramatically change it or transform it in the way in which the thin sliver of cosmopolitanism that shapes my identity and my life in the city. And I think the critical question to ask is why that's not happened. At some level, policy has touched upon, or the shaping of the city has taken the poorest of the city, or at least some proportion of the ordinary middle class, the second, the not quite the bottomest of the pyramid, but a little further up of the pyramid, into account in terms of how it's imagined its development. But it has done so in deep contestation with the elite. And that deep contestation with the elite has also created its own perversion. So we tried, for example, one of the big highlight moments I recall, only because I used to be stuck in traffic jams for the longest time. As an elite, I lived in an unauthorized elite colony that didn't want to be authorized, precisely because it didn't want to have to pay tax for all the public services that you get from being in an authorized colony. But we had to drive across the city to get into our workplaces where the BRT was being built. All of us in our cars complained heavily, but never really engaged with the fact that this whole exercise was meant to open up spaces for the bulk of the city to move. In the end, as it turned out, the elite imagination won. So I think that contradiction of how these aspects of a city are shaped, it also shapes into the complexity of governing Delhi. You talk in your book about this emergence of a whole new kind of bureaucratic sets of institutions. And you mentioned in your chapter as well, and in the presentation, the new kind of bureaucrat, the PwCs, the KPMGs. We see these consultants everywhere actually as part of our policy work. The Indian state is actually much more privatized, not because the private sector is giving you health and education alone, but also because the average bureaucrat now is the KPMG consultant making the PowerPoints for the state, as opposed to the state cadre officers who are coming into the state to do their jobs. But in all of these, and each of these are bringing new imaginations into the city and into what the city should be, and that are then shaping the discourse of the city, where some voices get heard and other voices don't. And I think the BRT story really captured that in more ways than one. In some ways, COVID too highlighted this in its most extreme ways. All of us in this room probably locked ourselves up in the comforts of our homes, and right across the road, the government school, at least near my house, had lines and lines of migrant workers. The migrant workers made themselves heard, but there's very little interest in really reshaping and reimagining how the slum, the low income home and the upper income home can live together and engage with each other, even as we depend deeply upon each other for services. And I think it's in these inequalities that the identity and the sort of parochialism gets further entrenched. So, the great puzzle that you started off with, why is it that an a large urban city doesn't perhaps create more versions of my life? May well be because in some ways, as a city opened itself up and democratized itself, more people came in, and in those inequities and elite contest and contestations, we actually ended up ghettoizing ourselves much more. And maybe the next generation of urbanization, which will come over a period of time, may actually create more people who make this a home where some of those ghettos start breaking. And our politics too has always grappled with this. I think Delhi is also, and many of the chapters reflect on this, has been the home of a lot of experimentation of trying to make politics more representative, more participatory. The emergence of the Aam Aadmi Party, which likes to at least pretend that doesn't have class or caste, is also experiments occasionally with different ways of trying to bring in people's voices into politics and policy making, are all part and parcel of these contradictions and tussles that are going on. And sometimes it creates some interesting policy, and I'll end here. I've spent in the last many years an inordinate amount of time trying to understand the Delhi government's transformations in Delhi's government schools. And it's a completely different story, which will be saved for another day. But one of the interesting aspects of that was this pivot that the education reform made somewhere halfway through. It started out with the concern, which was my concern when I went in to study it too, of how do you ensure that a schooling system actually provides for basic learning for children that are entering into the schooling system. And in the time that we spent with teachers, and I heard this a lot more in Delhi than I've heard with talking to teachers in rural India, the middle class female teachers, which is the dominant demographic of teachers, saying that when they first came into these schools, they were completely the biggest shock to their system and the sense of complete helplessness came from the fact that they encountered students from extremely difficult backgrounds in ways that they had never experienced or understood, and that they felt that as teachers they just didn't have the tools to be able to respond. So one male teacher actually said he was feeling very upset with himself the day we were interviewing him, because there was a girl in the classroom who had fallen asleep, and he shouted at her and was close to being extremely sort of angry, until finally she said, well, the slum we live in had been razed to the ground overnight, and so I had to spend some of the night sleeping on my father's ready in order to pass the night while he was running around trying to figure things out. And the teacher said, I can't even imagine what it means to be that child, and it's my job now to teach it. What was interesting about all these narratives is that you think about one of the big shifts that the Delhi education reform made in the middle of its reform was to say, there's all this stuff that we should worry about, whether a student in class 9 can actually read a letter, read a paragraph, read a story. And I was just looking at the numbers post-COVID and reopening of schools yesterday to see that only about 50% of kids in standard 9 can actually read a paragraph as on date. So that's really something for us to worry about a lot. But also an education system has to respond to the inequalities and the difficulties of what city life produces. And so it produced a very interesting shift in what they call the happiness curriculum, which I used to laugh at to begin with. But the more time I spent in the school, I realized, given the kind of environment that we have created in our cities, its inhospitability, its lack of dignity, the ability for a school to, at minimum, and especially given that the school can't actually teach you how to read a paragraph over 50% of the children in the school, the ability of the school to create a sense of emotional resilience, just the ability to close your eyes and meditate for 10 minutes. It's not a small thing. It's actually a huge, huge shift in what we think we can give and how policy can respond to the challenges and constraints of a large megapolis, its invisibilization, its inequalities, and its indignities, which perhaps over time may make for a different way of thinking about what we need to do as in terms of building policy for cities like Delhi, creating cities that are, you know, beyond terms of inclusiveness, equity, which are part and parcel of the policy lexicon, but also thinking of what it means to be a genuinely humane city that may address many of the challenges that you spoke about also when you spoke of the challenge of environmentalism and pollution, and how to think about caste, religion in this context, and how to think about how communities and people interact with the state and capital. I'll stop there to open it up. I think we have, Neelan, you're the timekeeper.
Like 15 minutes to 3:10.
Okay, so you open to questions from the audience here, and you'll translate the Zoom questions.
When people are,
Okay, let me start.
there's a hand up over there. That's all right.
I said I had two questions. I mean, one was more of a question about the environment. So we said there were four big stories that we had to follow. CNG, the relocation industries, waste management, and fire crackers. And I'm just wondering whether you had a chance to kind of dive into transport related, more recent transport related things like the water scheme or the ambient air purifiers along highways, so that. And of course, the national green preference and the construction industry in terms of environmental, specifically, you know, the politics, everything else is stopped, but actually is so going as massive. So
Central Vista one.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, your thoughts on that? One sort of response I just had to the latest thing that was going on about ghettoization. I just want to say, I think we are a little careful in how we aestheticize ghettos, because there is a tendency to judge colonies based on service level benchmarks A, B, C, and sort of have a sense of what is a ghetto. But I think we've been, some has also been trained very well by Western Chicago school urbanism to think about what the ghetto is, and because much like, you know, the elite unauthorized colony, and much like most of Delhi, which is going through a sort of a pretty big boom in terms of like bigger floors and stuff like that. I'm going to argue this pretty much everything's a ghetto, and in different ways. It's how do we separate the material, the social, the cultural from the aesthetic, and be able to talk about ghettoization in some sort of concrete terms, which are, there are objective terms for ghettos, but let's, you know, how do we talk about that without aestheticizing the word
I would say if I have the substantive, I know nothing about construction industry, so it would be unfair of me to dive into that. I know that in the, see, I personally get more interested in, so when IIT Delhi produces a report, then what comes number one? So sometimes construction, sometimes transport. That tells me a bit more about how, because I'm not a technical person. I can't, you know, beyond a point go into the details. I try and follow what people are saying. Certainly, for instance, on air purifiers, that Delhi government has the smoke towers. Every person that I know who has written a half serious piece on air pollution says it's bunker. So I don't know why Delhi government has invested so much. I have no independent review of that. I can't do that review. Audible, I do have a sense of, and I think it was a half-hearted scheme implemented badly. If it was left to me, I would do a stronger audible scheme than the kind that was done. It's better not to do that. Rather than this, ek saal kar denge, kuch mahino ke liye kar denge. So have a well thought out scheme. Do you want fewer cars on the roads? Is what even the only way to ensure that? Are there other ways to ensure that? This was simply a reactive measure, got them a lot of flack, and they haven't gone back to it since then. So I think that one was certainly, one of those things that could have been thought and implemented much better if they wanted to implement it. So as I said, on those technical details, I prefer to read people who know the technical stuff and then try and make my own sense of what is happening in terms of what the government is doing.
Two questions interested me most. One was, when does Delhi become a whole? I belong to Delhi, was born here. I know Delhi, how it has grown over the decades. I will get back to you in a second. And the second question was, how do we compare Delhi with other cities, anywhere in the world, internationally or nationally? Now, the second question was more interesting in the sense that there are a few data points where we don't really have to look at Delhi in comparison with Beijing or any other place, but we compare Delhi with Delhi itself. And the first important data point is really what was Delhi in 1947, what became of Delhi in 1962, when the first master plan came into being. Or perhaps there was a midpoint, and I'm surprised that Dr. Srivastava did not mention that, which was in 1955 when the Delhi School of Economics and the Institute of Economic Truth also mounted a very massive Greater Delhi survey published as Greater Delhi Study in Urbanization, edited by Dr. V. Rao in PB Now, if you simply look at these three data points, you will get a picture which is quite different from the one that is presented in this book. In 1947, there were three parts of the exit. One was civil lines, one was Shahana, which you mentioned quite in detail. Second was the Luton study. The third part was the civil lines conducted by Kashmiri Gate, and a little bit of extension that really took place beyond the University of Delhi, subsequently. The character of these three places was completely different from each other. At the same time, there was a tremendous amount of complementarity rather than contradiction in these three components, each one supplementing the functions of each other. That is the way it really grew up in, that is what it was in 1947. When the first master plan was published, which incidentally, interim plan is mentioned in the book, but as far as I could see, I did not find a mention of the first master plan of Delhi. And a point that he made about industries not being here, one of the decisions that was taken that the Delhi master plan was that Delhi will not host any large industry. It will have medium and small scale. And that is how the Oakland industrial estate came with small scale industry. There were only two large industries in Delhi. One was the Delhi cloth mills, and the second was the Quella cotton spinning mills. These were the two very large mills in Delhi, and they had to be closed down as a result of the recommendations made in the first master plan of Delhi. And they were closed down, eventually leading to all kinds of issues. I found, I think in the chapter on housing, and I come to your chapter in a second, one very important omission in terms of the types of houses.
Can we move on a little?
Pardon?
Can we move on a little bit?
Yeah, I'll just take 2 minutes. No, not more than that. One is that the book does not bring out the role of Katras in Delhi, just like we have Bastis in Calcutta, we have Chauls in Mumbai, we have Ahadas in Kanpur, and we have the famous Katras of Delhi. And there's a very interesting book by Chandiwala, The Katras of Delhi, which played a very, very important role in the whole setup, both in Delhi and the impact of that on the whole economics of how old Delhi really functioned. That was one point. And the second omission that I found, which was more like looking into the reference, very interesting two publications, one by Jhagwala. I don't know how it missed out. And second is the report by Patwansi, where it quotes, since you begin your book with a quote from Mirza Ghalib, there's also a quote from Shah Jahan, which is inscribed in the private quarters in the Red Fort, where it says, if there is a paradise on earth, it is here, it is here, it is here, and that's it. Thank you, Sanjay. I'm meeting Sanjay after 2 decades, and I
bring such perspective and such depth to your understanding. And thank you for close reading. Thank you for closely reading the material. I mean, that I appreciate it.
I read.
Other requests?
I think if we can just take a couple from Zoom because we are running out of time. I'll just take a couple. I'll pose a few, and we can take one more from the audience, and then you all can give your final responses.
Yamini, I had to for another meeting.
Oh,
yeah, I want to say.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Anyway, we'll take a brief tea break before the next session, so at least we'll get to have a little bit of an interaction. So let me just very quickly. One is a question to Sanjoy regarding Indian urbanization, not really leading to major social change. Do you think Indian cities and Delhi have failed to offer the idea of a melting pot? And the second one, on community as space and formation of common interest groups. There are a wide range of social groups beyond state and social family networks that respond to the need for establishing new networks within the same class as a way of dealing with isolation associated with urban life and enabled by new digital technology. How do you look at this phenomenon? And I'll ask one more, which is about the expansion of Delhi, which has happened largely on village lands, but village areas have been left intact within the city, which reflects inequalities of all kinds as often quoted in master plan documents. Similar urbanization has begun in all expanding and growing cities. Anyone would like to comment on what kind of inequalities will reach from Delhi, the nation's capital, to other urbanizing parts of India? So really, does Delhi reflect what is going to happen in the rest of the country or happened in other megapolises and happening as the transition to urbanization is taking place?
Let me take a quick crack and then.
Sorry, just give me 1 second. We'll just take one question from the audience.
Thank you very much. My question is very simple. You know, every city, we have been to Chennai, Chandigarh, and many more cities. Indore is very beautiful. This is a tourism hub also. But the heart of the city, I have not heard anything but on Diwali, the firecrackers, you were just making a remark. You know, the culture of the city is known by the culture program you perform. Although we have a lot of, centers of culture, maybe right Monday House to India International Center and Lodi Road. What else? But if you go there, the standard and the way they are conducting, it appears it's just a debate or a talk, but no actual cultural program is being, either good music, dance, or anything. That is a life and soul of the, because you are always in a sort of tension, And if you say you go and watch TV, for how long you will watch TV? So this becomes the sole purpose of it. How far the book envisages the cultural programs.
We actually are unable to touch on culture at all. So
that's right. This is what I want to hear.
Yeah, we were. So let me take a first crack that Srivastava can follow. It is obvious. It was always obvious. It continues to be obvious to us that Delhi is many cities, right? And Partho, who's leaving right now, was at one point headed a project called Cities of Delhi. So our project really brought in enormous quantities of very detailed data, most of which we were unable to look at because we couldn't mount the expertise to look at. So what I try to do, I'm not saying that everybody else tried to do that, is how do you, in this complexity, in this multifarious types of and sources of information, how do you find the story or the stories? What's key? How can you simplify and find theory? I mean, that's the objective of theory, is find that story. And I think what we ended up with a sense of it, the melting pot question is interesting. The idea that we are in some ways a melting pot nation, quite unlike any other in the world. But the metaphor I personally prefer is bento box. For those of you who have encountered it, is I think it is much more apt for our society, is that all these pieces are there, this language, that group, that jati, that cultural practice, that song type, sab hai, all of it is there. And they kind of can see each other, but from their own little boxes. They never mix together. And the question is this a good urban practice? Is this sustainable urban practice? Can cities prosper and survive and move along in this form of fashion? I do not know the answer to that question. I suspect, as with Srivastava and Deepu and all of us, we find that our systems find ways to adapt, find new institutional, semi-institutional, governmental, non-governmental, judicial, different kinds of mechanisms to kind of grease the processes, just get over the little bumps and never really ask the big question of survival as a society, survival as a city. I'm going to stop over there. I mean, underlying the point of trying to find the core story or stories in this complexity of perspective and experience. Sanjay, would you like to add something?
Just quickly, I mean, I know I'm getting drinking into tea time, but one is that digital technology and community. I think, like I remember once I was going to park in the metro station, so I was walking, my car was parked. There's a guy who was driving out, and it was just rained, and there's a metal bar, and you could see I was walking there, but he almost ran into me, or I had to sort of duck into the metal bar. But I want to say that one of the things that digital technology is doing, it seems to me, something quite peculiar about a large city, is that I don't think we know how to deal with strangers in a city, such really that. Primarily, we are good to those people in the city whom we know in some ways. They're part of a friend circle, they're part of some family kinship. We have no ways of how to deal with strangers, by which I mean the most banal way that you can deal with strangers, saying hello or whatever, or because of the kind of history that Delhi has. And I think interesting what digital technology may do, again, I'm not a technological determinist, is to perhaps open up that idea. How do you deal with strangers? The other thing is that if you're walking along in Delhi and also other cities, a man can stand in the middle of the road, turn his back to the traffic and start peeing because the public disappears immediately. Because we don't actually have a sense of a public that is there. If you turn your back to the public disappears. And that's the other thing about Delhi, it's a large city. You can see people.
And we look away too.
Yeah. Or we look at it as if, and the person who's taking a peek it's like the public had disappeared, but turning it back to the public. These are two things that are interesting in terms of what digital technology might do. Second point is the culture, and I was thinking that Delhi is peculiarly one of the few cities in the world where culture is free. There is no, historically what's happened in Delhi, the relationship between the state and private sector has produced extraordinary number of musical festivals you go to that you pay for thousands, hundreds of pounds and dollars in most other cities, which is an interesting development that's happened in Delhi, whether it's the ITC or whatever, Habitat Center, IIC. I have never paid for a single cultural event, which is something peculiar about this city that's developed a Nehruvian model, corporate and state thing. And you know, that's and the whole thing, you know, is interesting. Sometimes I think that maybe it's not such a bad thing that people don't feel at home. What's happened in those cities that people feel completely at home is going to be ethnic violence that Delhi has not experienced to the same extent. If you think of whether it's Tamil nationalism or Marathi nationalism, I think it's important for people to be at home. But one of the that in the Bonana have always a love-hate relationship with Delhi. But one of the things about Delhi is because it's no one's home, it's much more difficult to say to people, go away. And that is, I mean, it's a terrible, I mean, I have to say I both love and hate this city, but that is one of the saving graces of this city.
But it
How are we
doesn't
going to say?
produce a Delhi identity in the same way. That's the
Yeah, it's a trade-off. And what should we do? I don't know.
So on the home thing, Sanjay, you're right. It helps that there are very few people who could claim Delhi as home in the sense of 7 generations living here. Now, my interest is slightly different. I'm interested in 2 different kinds of migrants. So the state that I come from, Bihar, the Bihari middle class in Delhi is both willing to live and die in Delhi, and also remain emotionally connected to Bihar. So they have 2 homes, but Delhi has become a home where you can live and also die quite comfortably. Or what seems to me, which became very evident with COVID, was that for the working class migrant, this can well be the city to live, but this is certainly not the city to die. So for them, also there are 2 homes, but they're very differently placed. And so in that sense, I'm thinking about who actually begins to feel comfortable. Maybe it has to do with the fact that the Bihari middle class feels that it's a city that has more hospitals, more whatever, because the Kerala middle class doesn't stay back in the same way. They can comfortably go back.
So we begin and end with claps. Right? I think we should. Yeah, thank you, Sanjay. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. We have tea outside, but before we close the session, I did want to just say one thank you related to the book that we haven't yet touched on, which is a special thank you to Cassie. I don't see Tariq in the room, but I think no, he's supposed to come here. It was what anyway, but in absentia, Tariq and Dinesh, this whole project has its origins in Cassie, and of course, CPR and Cassie have a long, deeply embedded relationship where it's home on both ends, I think. So, you know, although some of us migrate there only for 3 months and then come back to die here, but just a very, very big thank you. This is one of many consequences of what a deep collaboration and fantastic partnership we have.
Yep. Start at 3:35.
We start at yeah 3:35.
Thank you.
So for all those in the room, coffee is outside.